First, as you might have noticed, President Putin's visit to Russian-occupied Mariupol in southern Ukraine has captured worldwide attention today. In the light of that visit, let's remind you of the early days of the Russian invasion and the devastating siege of Mariupol. On NewsHour a year ago today, we heard from the Ukrainian MP Dmytro Gurin, whose parents were still in the city at the time.
In general, people don't have heating, electricity, water, no communications at all. So it's medieval conditions. And several days ago, tanks started to shoot 9-story buildings. Some shelling never stops and shooting never stops. And the airplanes, they drop hundreds of bombs per 24 hours. And when I say 100, I mean literally 100. So people cannot go out and everybody is sitting just in their apartments, in the basements and waiting if they will die next hour.
A few days earlier, the theatre in Mariupol had been struck by a Russian missile. Hundreds of people had been sheltering inside. And before that, a maternity hospital famously was hit. By the middle of May, Russian forces had taken full control of the city. The images shown today represent the first time President Putin has visited Mariupol since the invasion. Footage, and we don't know exactly how recent it is, shows Mr. Putin driving in the dark while Russia's Deputy Prime Minister for Construction and Regional Development, Marat Husnulin, sits in the passenger seat talking about plans to rebuild the city.
The downtown area has been badly damaged. Some of the buildings are historic monuments. We were debating whether to demolish them or not. In the end, we've decided to keep them. We want to finish reconstruction of the centre by the end of the year, at least the facades. The centre is very beautiful. We're approaching it. You'll see it.
So what else does the film of Mr. Putin's visit to Mariupol show? The BBC's diplomatic correspondent James Landale is in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev.
It shows a helicopter landing. Apparently it looks around dusk last night. There's images of Mr. Putin driving himself away in a vehicle. There are images of him then touring the city. We see him visiting a floodlit playground in the middle of what is possibly a reconstructed residential area. We see pictures of him visiting the inside of a renewed, rebuilt theatre. We think it's the Philharmonic Theatre, which is not the theatre that sheltered civilians and was destroyed in a Russian airstrike, one of the early allegations of a war crime in this conflict. But it's the theatre where Russia was potentially planning to hold show trials for some of those Ukrainian fighters who were defending Mariupol before it was finally captured by Russia back in May. We also see Mr. Putin talking to residents on the streets. We also see him visiting the inside of someone's home. Again, all in darkness, all in the middle of the night. You know, that it might be an impromptu visit, but there's the family he visited had a very large table full of food in preparation for this late night visit. So essentially, these are images of a leader visiting a captured city that is in the process of reconstruction.
Well, the Ukrainian Defence Ministry said Vladimir Putin's visit took place at night as, quote, befits a thief. But it will be seen as a personal show of defiance after Friday's announcement by the International Criminal Court that it had issued an arrest warrant for war crimes for the Russian president. There's a celebratory awareness of that arrest warrant among most Ukrainians. In Russia, there's little awareness of the court's existence, and Putin loyalists have dismissed it as irrelevant. Petro Andriushchenko is advisor to the mayor of Mariupol, Vadim Boychenko, although both he and the mayor are now away from Mariupol in parts of Ukraine still under Kiev's control. He's watched the footage of Mr. Putin visiting Mariupol, and he gave me his reaction.
I don't know, it's a fury. But I'm sure the next time we can see Putin in Mariupol, in the same building of Mariupol Philharmonic, with International Criminal Court, because it's a question about justice. Mariupol is the biggest crime of Russian troops and personnel. Putin, of course, during Ukraine invasion, Putin wants to say to the people that he is okay and he don't frightened about war. But it isn't true, because we can see absolutely different situation when he walk around the city.
To an extent, the images are true, aren't they? There are new houses, there are new playgrounds, there is some rebuilding in Mariupol.
We can see lots of video, but we have to know it's just one area. It's just one area that built by Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. It's not so big area. It's just 5 or 7 buildings. He wants to show how the Russia helped rebuild the Mariupol, but it isn't true.
You've got friends and family in Mariupol. What are they telling you about the reality of what the city looks and feels like right now?
The reality of Mariupol is awful, of course. It's awful because our people isn't live inside the city. They have to survive. At the same time, they haven't any humanitarian assistance. And how they can survive in this situation, we don't know.
Does it surprise you that there are civilians willing to be filmed talking happily in a friendly way to the Russian president in Mariupol?
No, I'm not surprised. We know we have some percent, near the 10% of people who stay in Mariupol now. It's absolutely pro-Russian view. So, an absolutely pro-Russian mind is special category of people, special kind of people. But it's not the biggest part of citizen of Mariupol.
Russia will want the city to flourish in a style that they choose now. They'll want Mariupol to be a symbol of success in the Russian invasion. Could it ever be?
No, it's impossible. You know, the last time what we can see, Russia haven't money for that. They stopped rebuild because they haven't money. They want to show this picture for all the world, but it isn't true.
That was Petro Andriushchenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol. Morten Risberg is a Norwegian freelance journalist who spent 3 days in the captured city of Mariupol in mid-December. He says parts of his visit, including the visa for going in, were organised by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was keen to advertise the reconstruction of Mariupol. But he also says he was able to talk to anyone he wanted to in the city, with the help of a Russian-speaking photographer from the European Press Agency, who was also on the trip.
Well, to paint a quick picture, even though I had seen photos of the immense destruction, it was still a shock for me to see how the invasion had just ravaged large parts of the city. And there were still neighborhoods and areas which was less affected, but mostly you could see destruction everywhere you looked. There were buildings flattened, walls blown out, holes by shrapnels and bullets everywhere, burnt down houses. But in the middle of this, there is also a large-scale rebuilding and restoration going on. At the time I was there, there were supposedly 15,000 construction workers present, all financed by Russia. And in some places, especially in the old town, you could see more construction workers than civilians. And these construction workers, they were demolishing some buildings, they were renovating others, but they're also building brand new apartment complexes to replenish the ones who are destroyed.
What did those new buildings look like?
They were just big, new, modern apartment complexes. One that I went to see personally was supposed to house 1,000 apartments. But even though these apartment complexes are huge, there are apparently still thousands and tens of thousands on waiting lists to receive one of these apartments.
Who did you speak to?
I spoke to several civilians, and what they said mostly is that they're now just focusing on surviving. And it's important to remember they have lived through the most brutal and relentless siege in modern history. Their focus is now just getting the necessities from day to day.
I suppose most of the civilians left in Mariupol are pro-Russian. Is that the impression you got?
Mostly, but people definitely gave different comments about the situation and how Mariupol is now occupied by Russia. Some people provided quite pro-Russian statements, while others were open about how they actually preferred it when the city was Ukrainian, because then they had peace. And several people said that before the invasion, they didn't really care and they liked both Ukraine and Russia. But when you see the situation they lived in now, they were longing for the days before the war.
Did people seem free to talk?
Seemingly they were free to talk, but in an occupied territory like this, you can never really know how free they are to voice their own opinion. And of course, they knew that they were speaking to a journalist, so I can only imagine that they might be a little bit afraid of voicing their actual opinion.
And of course, you were only allowed in by permission and by arrangement of the Russian Foreign Ministry. What effect did that have on the visit, would you say?
It didn't have that much of an effect because while I was present in Mariupol, I could still talk to anyone I wanted. But there was still, of course, the language barrier, which I was provided help with by a Russian photographer. And there were also some people who spoke perfect English, and there was no one looking over my shoulder or controlling who I spoke to. But of course, it's important to have in mind that the people you do speak to, that they might speak through a filter.
Clearly, the Russian government wants to hold up Mariupol as some kind of trophy, a symbol of some success in the invasion. Does it seem like that at all?
Yeah, with all of this rebuilding going on, this also means that they're shaping it into a Russian city. They're changing street names and they're painting over Ukrainian colors with Russian colors, and they're putting Russian flags everywhere. Just as an example, in the courtyard of one of the newly erected apartment buildings, even children's playgrounds are painted in red, white, and blue. So you can definitely tell that they're really trying to hold it up as a success of what they would call a liberation.
You saw plenty of civilian graves, though, didn't you?
Yes, I was also able to visit the main churchyard cemetery outside the city center. And there you could just see trenches in rows and columns just stretching over the field. And there were wooden signs with numbers on them. Me personally, I could see up to the number of 4,000. While I know that other journalists have seen over 10,000 new graves.
You wrote about meeting a man whose wife was killed after a grenade hit their apartment. Can you tell me about that?
Every civilian you speak to, they have some sort of story of tragedy and loss. But this story in particular, he told me that he was in the apartment with his wife and son. When a grenade hit the apartment, he explained that his wife was immediately decapitated. But his son was still alive, but gravely injured. So he took his son in his arms and he was running down the street to get him to the hospitals while the war was still going on in the streets and bullets were flying. Suddenly he felt a nudge in his son, and then he looked down, and then something had hit his son and he passed away.
That was Morten Risberg, freelance journalist and photographer with his own observations about a visit to Mariupol, made in mid-December, the end of last year. You're with the BBC World Service. Live from London, this is NewsHour. On the programme today, an emergency financial deal is struck in Switzerland, but will it be enough to stem fears of a global banking crisis? We reflect on exactly 2 decades since the invasion of Iraq, and we ask how much might be paid at auction for an entire Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton. That's later. First, Ukraine has condemned President Putin's visit to the city of Mariupol, which his troops ruined and then occupied. An aide to President Zelensky called Mr. Putin a criminal returning to the scene of his crime. It was the first time Mr. Putin had been to a newly occupied Russian territory in Ukraine since ordering the invasion last year. His visit came 2 days after international prosecutors formally accused him of being a war criminal. The Kremlin described his trip as spontaneous. Russian state media said he flew in by helicopter and drove around the city himself. Exactly a year ago, here on NewsHour, we heard from the Ukrainian MP Dmytro Gurin, whose parents were in Mariupol at that time.
In general, people don't have heating, electricity, water, no communications at all. So it's medieval conditions. And several days ago, tanks started to shoot 9-story buildings. And shelling never stops and shooting never stops. And the airplanes, they drop hundreds of bombs per 24 hours. And when I say 100, I mean literally 100. So people cannot go out and everybody is sitting just in their apartments, in the basements and waiting if they will die next hour.
A few days before that, the theatre in Mariupol had been struck by a Russian missile. Hundreds of people sheltering there were killed. Before that, quite famously, a maternity hospital was hit and lives were lost there. By the middle of May, Russian forces had taken control of a city that was largely destroyed, without basic services, and many thousands of its inhabitants had fled. The footage shown today, we don't know exactly how recent it is, shows Mr. Putin driving through part of Mariupol while Russia's Deputy Prime Minister for Construction and Regional Development, Marat Kushnulin, sits in the passenger seat and tells the president about plans to rebuild.
The downtown area has been badly damaged. Some of the buildings are historic monuments. We were debating whether to demolish them or not. In the end, we've decided to keep them. We want to finish reconstruction of the centre by the end of the year, at least the facades. The centre is very beautiful. We're approaching it. You'll see it.
The mayor of Mariupol, Vadim Boychenko, has been speaking to the BBC today, giving his reaction to Mr. Putin's visit.
Я відчуваю, як і всі українці, як і всі маріупольці, що
Like all Ukrainians, like all Mariupol residents, I feel that today a war criminal, whose name is Vladimir Putin, visited the scene of a crime he committed for several months in a row, meaning carried out his main mission as a war criminal, destroying the city of Mariupol. The only city where the Russian aviation used carpet bombing is Mariupol. The UN has already assessed what happened directly in Mariupol, regarding the drama theatre where the word children was written with huge letters. This did not stop the Russian military jet, which destroyed the drama theatre and killed hundreds of people there. Today, this is a sign of a war crime. Today's visit is Vladimir Putin's reaction as a war criminal to the warrant he received for the war crimes committed, in particular in Mariupol directly.
Well, the mayor also gave his assessment of the city today after images and videos shared by Russian state broadcasters showed Russian rebuilding work.
Він же ж не показує те, що він зробив з містом. Треба розуміти, що 2 місяці такого щільного вогню, який
They do not show what he did to the city. In 2 months of such dense fire that the Russian army under the leadership of its main war criminal Putin, in 2 months, only in 2 months, they destroyed the city by 50%. Every second high-rise building no longer exists. 90% are damaged. What did they build? And most importantly, where did they build it? And for whom did they build it? They built houses on the outskirts of the city, where there is no electricity, water supply and drainage communications. They built this just to prove that their version of what's happening there is true. But they lie. They lie that they came to liberate the city. They destroyed it. The city does not exist any longer, and it takes 20 years to restore it.
The words there of Vadim Boychenko, the mayor of Mariupol, who is currently in Kiev. Well, Andriy Kostin is the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Alongside other teams, his has been documenting thousands of war crimes alleged to have been committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine, including the abduction of children, the concern of the International Criminal Court. He came into the NewsHour studio today just before we came on air, and I asked him first whether he was surprised to see the footage of Vladimir Putin in Mariupol.
I think it's usual for perpetrators to come back to the crime scene to relive the sense of the crimes they have committed, and I think it's a real example of it, because the crimes committed in Mariupol against civilians, including children, we all know. So the bombing of Mariupol Drama Theatre, the bombing of Mariupol Maternity House. And we can only imagine the number of innocent civilians killed. We think the number could be tens of thousands killed in Mariupol. So I think that this was just an example of such a perpetrator's pattern.
But the visit comes just 2 days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin. Russia doesn't recognise that court. Clearly, Mr. Putin thinks he is entirely immune. It's a demonstration of that, isn't it?
I think it's very weak example of trying to demonstrate this, since we know that following arrest warrant issued, the International Criminal Court will serve specific notification to the member states. And we're talking about 122 countries who should arrest and execute this arrest warrant in case Putin will appear on their soil. And also Interpol will be involved. We are not naive. We all understand that this could be a long story. But it's very important for everyone on the globe to understand that if they think they are civilized people, they need to think 3 times before trying to shake hand to Putin.
But you know the reality of law enforcement in this case. President Putin is highly unlikely to be arrested. He's likely to go to South Africa, for instance, for a major international conference. They're not going to put him in handcuffs there, are they? You know that.
I don't know what will happen actually, so we can speculate on the potential reaction of South African authorities, but I don't think it will be so simple. They will think very carefully before he goes or not, or how they will handle it. And I think that nobody knows how history will develop. Many of our experts, who are now worldwide recognized experts, were young lawyers when they started to work in former Yugoslavia tribunals. And they told me they never imagined Milosevic or Karadzic to be in the dock when they started their work. So for us, for lawyers and international legal community, the most important is to follow the evidences, to follow the law, and to implement everything necessary that if in case Putin will be put in the dock, we have prepared everything from our side for him to be fairly prosecuted and, I believe, convicted.
You're here in London to promote international cooperation in bringing Russia to justice for what's been done in Ukraine. Will it work? What are you doing?
Oh, I believe it will work because our approach is multifaceted. Nevertheless, it's very challenging during wartime to ensure and to provide justice. But I will just give you some figures. We have in Ukraine during wartime, within 1 year, notified of suspicion 293 potential perpetrators, of which 29 have been already convicted by Ukrainian courts, some in person, some in absentia. And it's only our national part of multifaceted criminal responsibility approach. We understand that 99+% of all cases will be prosecuted and tried in Ukraine. Beside of it, we have the International Criminal Court, where the first steps have been already taken, and I'm very grateful for Karim's team, not only for taking this case as a priority, but also as handling first case, exactly showing the complementary nature of the ICC with regard to our national system, because we can do everything except people who are members of so-called Troika, president of country, prime minister, and minister of foreign affairs. They have personal immunity in any country of the world. And the ICC is the only possible way to prosecute them. And first case in Ukrainian situation was handled with regard to person whom we cannot reach because of his immunity. Third element of multifaceted system are national investigations, which are opened in 20+ countries. And we are trying to also to coordinate these efforts in order to avoid overlapping and in order also to provide possibility to exchange evidences which are collected in these countries with ICC and with Ukraine and within these countries, in order not to miss any evidence which is collected and just kept in safe for any future investigation. So our approach is multifaceted, and we are not forgetting about the crime of aggression, the primary crime, the mother of all other war crimes. And for me, I will tell you frankly that Putin being suspected in war crime already by the ICC means that he is automatically suspected in the crime of aggression, because if aggression would not occur, he would be not involved in the war crime of deportation of Ukrainian children. I
can see, finally, how determined you are. Are you also optimistic that President Putin will end up in court?
I'm always optimistic with all of endeavors of Ukraine with regard to make Putin, his team and all Russia perpetrators accountable. Once again, we do everything possible for him and others to be not only in dock but in jail.